Hi, guys. Today, we will start with the story When Death Came in Black. A heavy sky hung over the narrow streets of a medieval city, like a harbinger of impending doom. Sunlight pierced through dense gray clouds only occasionally, casting the stone buildings in somber shades. People walked slowly along the cobblestone roads, heads bowed and faces hidden in scarves, trying to shelter from the cold wind that carried sinister smells of dampness and decay. A heavy silence filled the air, broken only by rare groans and the rustle of clothing, faint reminders of lives slowly dying under the weight of an unknown disease. This disease, the plague, did not ask for names or social status. Its merciless cold crept into every home and heart, consuming families and shattering destinies. At first, small spots appeared on the skin, black as shadows. Then fever and weakness followed, and finally, a torturous death that left only emptiness and fear. People stopped believing in salvation or hope, as every day brought new deaths, new victims of the plague. The city descended into chaos, streets filled with bodies that no one could bury. Doctors dressed in black cloaks and masks with long beaks went from house to house, helplessly raising their hands, unable to stop the plague. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but their eyes betrayed fear and despair. Church bells fell silent, and nuns and priests, frightened and exhausted, tried to aid the dying, though they knew their turn would come soon. Houses grew cold, even when candles burned, not from the wind, but from the absence of life. Children cried, elders remained silent, and women prayed, but their prayers went unheard. All of Europe stood still, gripped by an invisible darkness that slowly but surely carried away generations. Every breath brought terror, every exhale drew death closer. Soon, rumors of the plague spread to every corner of the land, crossing forests and rivers, reaching even the most remote villages and fortresses. Everyone knew. No one was safe, and the disease chose no victims. Quarantine measures were soon established in every city and village, but they were only weak barriers against the ruthless plague. People tried to isolate the sick, hiding them in dark corners, but the disease always found new ways to penetrate. In houses that once echoed with life and laughter, now only the smell of bitterness and decay lingered. Sometimes it seemed as if the walls themselves absorbed suffering and fear, becoming a heavy burden on the living. A mother losing her child lay motionless, closing her eyes to avoid witnessing the last agonies. The elderly, weakened and forgotten, quietly left this world without leaving a word or a tear. The air was filled with the hollow echo of someone's last breath, an indescribable sorrow. City streets grew emptier. People feared to go outside, afraid to encounter the incurable plague. Merchants closed their shops, workers abandoned their tools, and disappeared into the unknown. Vagabonds and beggars vanished, dissolving into the shadow of this terrible epidemic. Doctors and healers searched for a cure, turning to ancient texts and folk beliefs, but nothing could stop the spread of death. Night descended on the city like a veil in which fear and death hid. Torchlight flickered in dark windows, casting long shadows on empty squares. The moon sometimes peeked from behind clouds, illuminating the grave silence and stillness. Under these conditions, even time seemed slowed, and every day felt like an endless struggle for a life that was slipping away. The plague seeped into every home, into every heart like a dark moisture, soaking life and destroying it from within. People became ghosts wandering the streets, their bodies wasted by disease, their eyes empty and desperate. The dying emitted soft groans that even the wind howling between rooftops could not drown out. Fear and hopelessness settled in souls, pushing out all hopes for healing and salvation. The city square, once noisy and full of life, had now turned into a grim place, an empty stage for a doomed drama. Along the walls stood carts loaded with coffins brought from every corner of the city. Carpenters worked without rest, making wooden boxes for those whom the plague spared no mercy. Their hands were covered in calluses, their faces worn from heavy labor and constant sights of death. Shepherds and peasants, having left their lands hoping to escape the disease, wandered deserted roads seeking refuge. But death showed no mercy. Even in the remotest village corners, it left its dark mark. Fields where bread and herbs once grew lay barren and forgotten. Children who never tasted the joy of life became the first victims of the incurable disease. At the same time, the church lost its influence and strength. Many priests could not explain why their prayers failed to save people, why the plague continued to devour souls and bodies. Some abandoned their posts, leaving parishes without spiritual support. Others stayed, fighting their own fear and wavering faith. Rumors spread in the cities of divine punishment, a terrible retribution for humanity's sins. Around unfolded a silent tragedy, where every day brought new deaths and every moment reminded of life's fragility. People stopped counting days and years. Their existence was reduced to awaiting the inevitable end. Sounds of laughter and joy vanished, replaced by cold and silence, the two constant companions of the plague. The first weeks felt endless, as if time stretched under the weight of grief and fear. People watched as their loved ones, friends, and neighbors fell victim to the plague one after another, powerless to help or prevent the inevitable. Each new day brought news of new families, empty homes, and silenced voices. During this time, the boundaries between life and death blurred, and death became almost tangible, as if it could touch every glance, every touch. Children who recently played in the streets now disappeared without a trace, taken by the disease, leaving parents in helpless sorrow. Their laughter was replaced by crying and moaning, and empty cradles filled with a silence no words could drown out. A mother held the withered body of her child, unable to believe she once carried, fed, and protected it. The elderly, who had lived long years, looked at what was happening with weariness and silent acceptance, as if preparing themselves for their own death. The city, once lively and noisy, turned into a desert of oblivion. Streets emptied, houses stood with locked shutters, their windows covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. Market stalls were bare, and no one dared to go outside even in daylight. The wind carried the smells of decay and ash, reminding of those who could no longer speak for themselves. City gates were locked, and no one entered or left without special necessity. Doctors and healers, once respected and trusted, now inspired fear and suspicion. Their methods seemed powerless, and their masks, sinister symbols of impending doom. People feared to approach them, suspecting that even touching a healer might be their last act. Meanwhile, in the dark corners, survivors tried to organize small communities to preserve the remnants of life and hope, though each day was filled with a fight for survival. Over time, the disease ceased to be something distant and invisible. It penetrated the deepest corners of people's minds, turning their world into a constant nightmare. Every sound, every rustle reminded of the approach of death. People feared not only infection, but also being left alone, forgotten and abandoned. Many tried to hide in their homes, closing doors and windows, hoping the plague would pass by, but hope grew weaker. Families fell apart. Spouses lost each other, parents lost children, and children lost parents. No one could protect their loved ones from the merciless plague. Abandoned houses and yards became places of last breaths and silent grief. Sometimes cries of despair echoed from houses, but they quickly died out, giving way to oppressive silence that grew heavier and drowned even memories of the past. The community that was once strong and united collapsed under the onslaught of fear and death. People stopped trusting one another, suspecting every stranger of being a source of disease. Shadows ran through the streets, hiding from light and eyes, searching for food and shelter. The homeless and the sick wandered between houses, becoming living ghosts of a lost world. The authorities and government were powerless against this catastrophe. Laws and orders seemed empty words when dead bodies lay at every step and the living were dying. Burial rites disappeared, replaced by inhumane attempts to remove bodies to prevent further spread of disease. Black hearses traveled the streets, collecting corpses, their sounds becoming a constant reminder of grief and loss. In these dark times, hope seemed lost forever. People stopped dreaming and planning for the future. Their existence turned into a struggle for every next breath. Pain and suffering became the everyday reality, impossible to avoid or ignore. In every city and village, only stories of loss were heard, about countless dead, about those who could not overcome the terrible disease. Some sought salvation in religion, turning to God with prayers and repentance. Temples and monasteries were filled with the suffering, hoping for a miracle. Priests performed rituals, trying to drive away the plague and its black presence. But even the strongest prayers seemed futile in the face of death that spared no one. Neither the poor nor the rich, neither the strong nor the weak. City life froze, as if stopped under the weight of inescapable grief. Market squares were empty, fairs gathered no merchants or buyers. People used to their usual rhythm of life now only watched their world collapse. Some tried to flee infected places, hoping to find refuge in distant lands, but the disease followed them, chasing and destroying all hopes. Many families vanished forever, taken by the plague, leaving behind emptiness and oblivion. Streets filled with abandoned belongings, forgotten homes, and coffins carried by faceless hearses. Grief became universal, for the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the young and the old. The plague erased all differences, forcing everyone to remember only mortality and the fragility of human life. Death, like an invisible black fog, enveloped towns and villages, bringing destruction and emptiness. People increasingly heard of those who vanished at night, not living to see morning, leaving behind cold bodies, unwanted and forgotten. Houses grew colder and quieter. Even the sound of footsteps seemed out of place in this oppressive silence. The air filled with bitterness and longing, and hearts were overwhelmed by hopelessness. Great buildings, temples and castles, symbols of power and grandeur, now seemed empty monuments of a fallen era. Stone walls kept the echoes of prayers and curses, and their dark halls became shelters for those trying to hide from the plague. But the plague knew no boundaries. It penetrated the strongest walls, destroying and devouring all living things in its path. New rites and rituals appeared, born of fear and despair. People lit fires in the streets, trying to cleanse the air of disease, offering gifts to gods and spirits, hoping to halt the Black Death. But no rituals could stop its march. It moved relentlessly, consuming all that was dear to people, destroying lives and destinies. Over time, fear turned into despair, and despair into madness. People lost touch with reality, saw ghosts, and heard the voices of the dead. Some fled to the forests, trying to hide from inevitable destruction, while others, unable to bear the fear, threw themselves into the abyss of deadly illness, as if meeting death face to face. With each day, the shadows of the plague grew longer and denser, engulfing more and more lands of Europe. Villages once full of life and laughter had turned into dead islands of oblivion. Abandoned streets and broken doors told stories of sudden death, of how quickly life could end. Even the strongest and healthiest fell, mercilessly taken by the disease, leaving behind nothing but emptiness. Many cities were forced to impose strict quarantine measures in an attempt to halt the spread of the plague. City gates were chained shut, guards stood watch at the outskirts, and the sick or suspected were isolated in special infirmaries, which often became places of final refuge. But the effort seemed futile. The disease broke through defenses, penetrating even the most isolated communities. Harsh punishments appeared for those who violated quarantine or tried to flee infected areas. Fear and paranoia grew, making people suspicious and withdrawn. Neighbors stopped helping one another, fearing transmission, and cities once united by trade and culture grew divided and closed off. Meanwhile, far from the cities, in rural areas, life continued but under the shadow of fear and the expectation of death. Peasant families living in the old ways tried to preserve traditions and natural rhythms. But even there, the disease left its black mark. People kept working the fields, gathering harvests, yet fear for the future and loved ones hung over every one of them. At the height of this catastrophe, the simplest human needs became the subject of brutal struggle. Food, water, and medicine all were in short supply. Trade routes were blocked or destroyed, and those who tried to trade risked infection or becoming victims of robbery. People desperate for help became increasingly isolated, trying to survive in a world turning into a death trap. Hunger and exhaustion weakened bodies, making even those not yet sick vulnerable to the plague. Children deprived of care and food walked weakly through empty streets in search of leftover bread or a drop of water. The elderly, having lost their strength, lay in their homes, watching as darkness slowly consumed everything they cherished. In these conditions, every day became a test, and survival, a rare fortune. Social norms and orders collapsed under the weight of chaos. People ceased to see others as individuals, turning into shadows of their own fear and pain. In some places, bands of marauders arose, looting and destroying everything in their path, taking advantage of lawlessness and absence of authority. Fear of death bred cruelty, and cruelty bred even greater chaos. At the same time, in the darkest corners, the survivors tried to preserve the remnants of humanity. They helped each other, shared their last supplies, prayed, and stayed together. These small islands of light in a sea of darkness showed that even in the darkest times, humans are capable of compassion and hope. In some places, figures appeared who seemed to embody the plague itself. Strangers in black, wearing heavy cloaks and masks, hiding their faces. Their presence was like a harbinger of death, and people feared even looking their way. These mysterious figures walked the streets, marking houses where disease lived, sealing doors so no one could enter or leave, and carrying away the bodies of the dead, leaving behind only silence and emptiness. With the appearance of these death bearers, urban legends and fears took flesh and blood. Children were afraid to go outside. Adults hid in their homes, and the elderly seemed to simply await the inevitable end. People did not know who these mysterious figures were, saviors or executioners. Their role remained shrouded in mystery, but one thing was clear: plague and death walked hand in hand. The image of the plague ceased to be just a disease. It became a symbol of the end of an era, destruction, and the inevitable fate of all humanity. With each day, people increasingly realized their fragility and temporariness. Standing helpless before the force of the disease, their lives seemed fragile, like a candle's flame that could be extinguished at any moment. In these conditions, faith in the future gradually faded, giving way to darkness and oblivion. But even in this gloom, deep inside, a faint spark of hope remained. Memories of the past, of love, of the belief that someday this terrible time would end, and life would rise again from the ashes. As the plague relentlessly continued its destructive march, human lives lost their former significance. Cities turned into grim cemeteries, where the living walked among the dead, finding no solace in anything. Street fountains, once noisy and lively, now stood lifeless, covered with layers of dust and grime, reflecting the silent emptiness around. Families that were once whole, now fragmented into pieces. Everyone tried to save themselves however they could. Some sought shelter, others fled from the disease. Many left their homes forever, drifting into the unknown with a last hope for salvation, though chances of it grew smaller. Instead of familiar streets, empty spaces where the wind scattered fallen leaves and ashes of burnt bodies. The heaviness of death was everywhere. Bitterness of loss lingered in the air, impossible to forget. Every street told its own story of pain, every stone slab in the cemetery a silent witness to thousands of fates. Despite all the cruelty, people tried to preserve remnants of human dignity. Those who stayed by the sick showed unprecedented resilience and courage, caring for them and risking their own lives. These small acts of kindness were like the last resistance in a world where death seemed the only law. The plague penetrated every corner of life, destroying not only bodies but also souls. Faith in justice, divine protection, and human happiness crumbled under the weight of endless suffering. People who once sought solace in prayers and rituals now often lost faith, experiencing despair and a deep sense of abandonment. Many began to see the plague not just as a disease, but as a curse, a punishment for the sins of humanity. This understanding bred both fear and anger. Some tried to find scapegoats, neighbors or strange outsiders suspected of witchcraft or spreading the contagion. Rumors and suspicions arose, only worsening panic and division among people. Nevertheless, despite all horrors, life continued to seek a way. Small shoots of hope appeared in the hearts of those who did not surrender to death. They tried to preserve knowledge, art, crafts, and traditions to pass them on to future generations. Amidst ruin and chaos, these few remaining kept the flame of humanity alive. Over time, new communities began to form, based on mutual help and support. People gradually learned to live in new conditions, adapting to the inevitability of the disease and finding ways to resist fear and loneliness. These communities became islands of life and light in a world plunged into darkness. As the plague continued to reap lives, the survivors witnessed irreversible changes in society. Old customs crumbled, and new forms of life and relationships emerged from the ashes of the old world. People began to realize that the old rules and laws no longer held power. New ways of survival and coexistence had to be found. Religious institutions, once wielding great power and influence, began to lose their authority. Many priests and monks themselves fell victim to the plague, and their words no longer brought comfort. The people split. Some continued seeking salvation in prayers, others in new knowledge, medicine, and science, which gradually began to break through the darkness of ignorance and superstition. Trade, though heavily damaged, did not disappear entirely. Small caravans and individual merchants risked their lives trying to deliver essential goods and medicines where they were most needed. This was a fragile but vital thread connecting scattered settlements and offering hope for renewal. In the cities, the first rudiments of sanitary services and disease control began to appear. People learned how the disease spread and tried to take measures, imperfect but important. These steps were the first bricks in the foundation of future medicine and public health. Through the darkness and despair, new life began to break through. Life born from the ashes of lost hopes. The lands devastated by the plague slowly regained strength. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of awakening birds was heard again. Nature continued its cycle, regardless of human suffering, as if reminding that life is always stronger than death. Those who survived the worst trials began to gather together to rebuild. They remembered what was lost, learned from mistakes, and created new customs that helped them cope with hardships. Local communities grew more united, understanding that only togetherness and mutual support could give them a chance to survive and thrive. Knowledge, once thought lost forever, slowly came back to life. Physicians and scientists, though limited in resources, shared experience and experimented with treatment methods. These were the first steps toward understanding how to fight the invisible enemy that had tormented humanity for so long. But even amid the revival, the shadows of the past did not disappear entirely. The memory of the dreadful plague remained deep in people's hearts as a warning and a lesson. It forever changed the face of Europe, its consciousness, and its destiny. And though death continued to be a part of life, it was now just a part of a much more complex and multifaceted story. Several years had passed since the plague took countless lives, leaving behind emptiness and pain. European cities, once densely populated and noisy, were now slowly coming back to life. But the memory of the catastrophe remained fresh. Markets and workshops reopened. People returned to their crafts and trade despite the constant fear that the disease might return. Women and men who had survived the terrible trials became the foundation of a new society, more cautious, yet more resilient. They built not just houses, but strengthened their bonds and relationships, understanding that their strength lay in unity. Education and knowledge became values that could protect against ignorance and chaos. Many sought meaning in preserving culture and traditions to prevent the past tragedies from being forgotten. Writers, artists, and sages passed down stories of those who had perished and those who survived, reminding future generations of the lessons from the past. These tales became part of collective memory, helping to realize the value of life and the fragility of human existence. However, the scars left by the plague were deep and visible, not only on the body of Europe, but also in the souls of its inhabitants. The fear of death and loss became a constant companion, shaping a new worldview, somber yet filled with a yearning for light and rebirth. The years following the plague became a time not only of physical recovery, but also of profound social change. The memory of the tragedy spurred a reassessment of values, roles, and relationships within society. People began to view life, death, faith, and power differently. The fear of disease made many reflect on the uncontrollable and the importance of being prepared for the unexpected. In some places, a new form of collective responsibility emerged, neighborly help and support for the most vulnerable. There was no longer time for divisions and conflicts, as survival demanded unity. Alliances and brotherhoods formed, carefully preserving knowledge about the disease and methods of protection, passing it down through generations. Special attention was given to caring for the sick and funerals, to avoid repeating the horrors of the past. Rituals became more strict, and the approach to death more conscious and respectful. People sought to preserve human dignity, even in the darkest times, showing compassion and care. Scientific inquiries, though in their infancy, began to receive support from rulers and communities. The understanding that disease was not divine punishment but a natural phenomenon gradually took hold. Physicians searched for medicines and preventive measures, collected statistics, and observed symptoms, taking the first steps toward developing medicine as a science. The winds of change slowly but surely penetrated into the depths of European cities and villages. Those who survived the horrors of the plague became guardians of new knowledge and customs that helped them survive and build the future. Along with them, faith returned to many hearts, not blind and thoughtless, but conscious, strengthened by experience and understanding of life and death. The first signs of a new era appeared: growth in crafts and trade, expansion of the knowledge about the world, improvement in sanitary conditions. Life became more meaningful and full, although the memory of the past never completely left people's hearts. They lived knowing the price of loss and the value of every day. At this time, perceptions of power were also changing. Kings and rulers, whose power once seemed limitless, now faced the necessity to consider the opinions of their subjects and scholars. They realized that maintaining stability required not only military might and laws, but also care for the health and welfare of the people. Education and culture became tools of revival and progress. Universities, though damaged during the epidemic, gradually rebuilt their walls and began educating a new generation of scholars and thinkers who were to lead Europe to new heights of knowledge and development. The countless losses and sufferings left deep scars on the body and spirit of Europe, but at the same time became a catalyst for inner revival. People began to value life and its fragility like never before. Fear of the unknown prompted a search for answers, and in this search, science was born. The systematic study of the nature of diseases and ways to treat them. Monasteries, once centers of religious life, increasingly turned into centers of knowledge and medicine. Monks recorded observations about symptoms and disease progress, collected herbs, and prepared medicines. In these harsh conditions, the first scientific works were born, imperfect though they were, forming the basis for future discoveries. Society began to adopt a more rational approach to epidemics. Rules of quarantine, isolation of the sick, and disinfection of homes were created. Although these measures were sometimes met with suspicion and fear, they still helped contain the spread of the plague. The first cities with organized sanitation and medical aid systems appeared, marking an important step towards a civilized society. Along with this, attitudes toward death changed. If it once seemed an inevitable sentence, it was now increasingly seen as part of a natural cycle that could be understood and controlled. This understanding brought hope and gave strength to fight the disease, awakening in people a desire to live and create despite the dark shadows of the past. The era of the plague, though marked by unprecedented horror and grief, also became a time when humanity seriously reflected on its vulnerability and interconnectedness for the first time. Images of the dead lying in mass graves and empty houses became symbols not only of destruction, but also of changes that could not be stopped. People gradually began to realize that the former way of life, with its arrogance and disregard for nature, had to change. The first signs of ecological responsibility and respect for the land appeared, which, despite human suffering, continued to provide food and life. Farmers learned to work the soil more carefully, preserving its fertility for future generations. A new wave began to awaken in culture and art, expressions of grief, hope, and the desire for renewal. Sculptors, painters, and writers conveyed the experiences of their time through their works, creating powerful images of death and life, suffering and salvation. These creations became not only a tribute to memory, but also a consolation, helping people understand and accept what was happening. Social structures changed. Families and communities became closer and more interdependent, giving rise to new forms of cooperation and mutual aid. In conditions of instability and fear, people learned to trust each other and value human closeness, which became key to survival and recovery. The memory of the Black Death was deeply imprinted in the consciousness of Europeans. It was a time when people first realized how fragile their lives were and how quickly everything could change. Streets once filled with the sounds and scents of life became silent corridors of fear and grief. Homes that once echoed with laughter and joy now reminded people of loss and emptiness. But it was in this silence and emptiness that new hopes were born. In cities, the first rudiments of sanitary services appeared. People understood that fighting disease required not only prayers and charms, but concrete actions. Hospitals and shelters for the sick were opened, where, despite limited resources, doctors and monks tried to ease suffering. The plague revealed the necessity of a systematic approach to healthcare, which would become the foundation for future generations. At the same time, the plague changed social structures. Family and neighborly ties grew stronger, as survival became possible only through mutual aid and support. Communities that were once fragmented now became strong units, where everyone was responsible for one another. This allowed people not only to survive, but to preserve a sense of community and human dignity. Scientific inquiry and attempts to understand the causes and ways to fight the disease gradually gained momentum. People began to realize that nature followed certain laws, and that knowing these laws could become a weapon against the invisible enemy. Thus, medicine was born, a science that would change the world over time. The plague forever changed humanity's relationship with the surrounding world. City squares, once centers of trade and communication, became places where people first began to speak not only about profit and power, but about life, death, and health. The mass death made people reflect on the value of each individual and the necessity of collective responsibility. The first attempts to organize a public healthcare system took place. Measures to control the movement of the sick were introduced, quarantine zones were created, and regulations on street and house cleaning were established. These measures, although far from modern standards, laid the groundwork for future sanitary reforms and epidemic control. At the same time, the influence of new ideas, philosophical, religious, and scientific, grew, offering different ways to understand the tragedy. Some saw the plague as punishment for sins, others as a trial and opportunity for renewal. Scientific thinkers began to propose hypotheses about the nature of the disease, giving hope for its overcoming. A new aesthetic began to form in culture, reflecting the tragedy and its aftermath. Visual arts and literature became means of comprehending pain and fear, as well as expressing hope for rebirth. Artists created canvases full of symbols and allegories, capturing not only the horror of death, but also the power of life. Society that survived the plague became more mature and cautious. It learned to value health and life, to respect nature and the people around. These lessons, written in blood and suffering, remained forever in humanity's memory, forming the foundation for future generations. The plague epidemic left an indelible mark on the social structure of Europe. Millions of deaths altered the demographic landscape of the continent, exposing vulnerabilities and imbalances in population distribution. Following the deaths came a period of social upheaval as the remnants of societies struggled to find a new order amid chaos and destruction. Surviving farmers and artisans became key figures in the revival of the economy. Vacant lands and workshops, emptied after the demise of former owners, passed to new holders, leading to changes in feudal relations. There was a growing desire for freedom and improved working conditions, laying the groundwork for future social changes. At the same time, the importance of knowledge and education increased. People increasingly understood that salvation from diseases and suffering was impossible without a scientific approach. Universities and medical schools gradually restored their activities, attracting those eager to uncover the mysteries of nature and the human body. The first medical treatises and manuscripts appeared, describing symptoms, methods of treatment, and prevention. These documents became valuable heritage, allowing future generations to learn from the mistakes and successes of their ancestors. They carried hope and a striving for control over the disease that once seemed insurmountable. Thus, the tragedy of the plague became not only a time of loss, but also a time of awakening of human intellect and spirit, preparing the ground for future achievements. Gradually, through the darkness and ashes left by the plague, Europe began to rediscover the value of human life and relationships. In this new world, where death became a constant shadow, people sought meaning and solace not only in religion, but also in science, art, and philosophy. Every sorrow endured became a stepping stone toward understanding what it means to be human amid inevitable vulnerability. Cities, once destroyed and deserted, slowly came back to life. People rebuilt their homes, trade, and crafts, but now with a new sense of responsibility for the health and welfare of the community. The first organizations aimed at helping the poor and the sick emerged, as no one could remain indifferent to the suffering of their neighbors. The culture of the era began to reflect the depth of experiences. Literature filled with dark imagery, and architecture imbued with symbols of salvation and hope. Artists and writers created works that not only captured horror and grief, but also gave strength to live on, learn, and grow. Society gradually became more tolerant and conscious, understanding that the common fate lies in unity and mutual aid. Those who survived the epidemic became teachers and guides for new generations, passing on the lessons of the past to avoid repeating tragedies. Over time, the influence of the Black Death began to be felt not only in demographic and social changes, but also in the profound reshaping of human consciousness and worldview. People living in the era of the plague began to reflect on the transience of all existence, on how easily life could be cut short, and on the fact that, beyond everyday concerns, there was something greater: the mystery of being, questions of meaning and eternity. Religious institutions, which became bastions of faith in times of crisis, simultaneously faced challenges. Millions of deaths undermined previous doctrines about divine justice and mercy. New movements and views emerged, attempting to comprehend the catastrophe as a test of spirit or the beginning of a new stage in human history. It was a period of spiritual searching and rethinking when people not only accepted death, but sought to understand its role in life. At the same time, the first steps towards systematic study of diseases were made in medicine and natural sciences. Observations of symptoms, analysis of conditions of spread, and even early attempts at experimenting with treatments laid the foundation for future medicine. Despite limited knowledge and lack of modern technology, these early efforts became milestones in the fight against epidemics. In culture, the plague left an indelible mark. The theme of death and suffering became central in works of art, literature, and philosophy. People sought to express through creativity the full range of emotions, from horror to hope, trying to find meaning and consolation in it. Thus, a new tradition was born, in which tragedy and the beauty of life intertwined into the unified fabric of human experience. The plague pandemic not only devastated the population of Europe, but also radically changed the daily life of every person, affecting all aspects of existence, from family relationships to the economy and culture. In many regions, traditional foundations collapsed, and people were forced to seek new ways of survival and adaptation. Many families were left without breadwinners, children became orphans, and villages and towns emptied. However, it was in these conditions that new solidarity arose. Mutual aid became not just a noble act, but a necessity for survival. People learned to share their last belongings, support the weak and sick, creating a kind of support networks that helped resist the horrors of disease and loneliness. The economy went through a deep crisis. Trade was interrupted, craftsmen lost clients, agriculture suffered from a shortage of labor, but soon a slow recovery began. New owners appeared in places. Crafts were revived with new technologies and knowledge. This process became the starting point for future economic and social reforms that changed the face of Europe. In cultural life, new genres and forms of art began to develop, reflecting tragedy and hope. Music, painting, and literature were imbued with motifs of grief, but also with a striving for renewal and light. These works became not only historical testimonies of the era, but also sources of inspiration for future generations, helping them comprehend the complex lessons of the past. The plague, an invisible and relentless enemy, invaded every corner of Europe, sparing no one. It knew no social status, wealth, or age. All became its victims. At a time when medicine was powerless and understanding the causes of disease was beyond people's reach, fear and despair filled hearts and minds. People tried to find any protection in rituals, prayers, amulets, but these measures often brought only temporary relief or no help at all. Cities where population density was high became epicenters of infection. Streets filled with corpses that could not be removed in time, and the smell of death became unbearable. Many fled their homes in an attempt to escape, but the disease quickly spread among the fugitives as well. In rural areas, where communities were more isolated, the plague arrived more slowly, but still brought devastation. The peace of the dead was disturbed. Traditional funeral rites often could not be performed, and bodies were buried hastily, sometimes simply thrown into mass graves. This only intensified fear and the sense of loss. People feared touching the sick and dead, leading to alienation and isolation even within families. Nevertheless, it was in such dark times that humanity's best qualities emerged: compassion, willingness to help, self-sacrifice. Despite the threat to their own lives, people cared for the sick and supported one another. Monasteries and churches became refuges where the wounded and defenseless gathered. Thus, despite all the cruelty of the epidemic, the plague became a catalyst for social change, awareness of life's fragility, and the importance of human solidarity, which helped endure and recover after the terrible blow. The memory of the plague and its consequences deeply embedded itself in the collective consciousness of Europe. The epidemic became not just a historical event, but a symbol of the inevitability of death and simultaneously the power of life. On streets and squares, among ruins and deserted houses, a new generation grew up, raised in the shadow of fear and grief, but unbroken and looking toward the future. Parents told their children about the terrible days, how anyone could become a victim of the disease, but also how people united to stand strong. These stories were passed down orally, becoming part of the folk epic, forming a cultural layer that served both as a reminder and a lesson. Local communities began paying great attention to hygiene and sanitation. For the first time in history, systematic cleaning of garbage, disinfection of streets, and control of water sources began. Special city services were established to monitor the health of the population, which became a precursor to modern sanitary services. Significant changes occurred in the field of medicine. Observations and experiences accumulated during the epidemic contributed to the development of medical science. The first medical guidelines, knowledge bases about diseases, and ways to prevent them appeared. This period marked the transition from a mystical to a scientific view of disease and health. In the spiritual sphere, despite all the upheavals, faith in healing and rebirth was preserved. People sought solace in prayers and rituals, as well as in creativity. Music and painting, literature and theater became means of expressing the deepest human emotions and aspirations. Thus, centuries later, the shadow of the Black Death continued to influence the development of European society, reminding of the fragility of life and the need for careful attitude toward it. Gradually, despite the destruction and losses, Europe began to revive, not only physically, but also spiritually. The plague seemed to expose the deepest fears and weaknesses of society, but also gave the opportunity to look into the depths of human nature and appreciate its strength and fragility at the same time. The wind of change brought by the epidemic penetrated all spheres of life, from political institutions to everyday customs. City walls began to be rebuilt. Streets were cleaned of dust and garbage, and houses dispelled the shadow of death with their newly lit fires. People returned to work and family affairs, but with a different perspective. Life was perceived as a gift that requires careful treatment and respect. Mutual aid and caring for others became an integral part of new norms. Rural communities, having lost much of their inhabitants, did not give up. On the contrary, they strengthened ties among themselves, creating new forms of cooperation. Common festivals and religious rites once again filled hearts with faith and hope, restoring the spiritual foundations of society. In science and medicine, interest arose in the systematic study of diseases and methods of prevention. The first educational institutions appeared, where future doctors received knowledge based not only on dogmas, but also on experience and observation. This step marked the beginning of a new era in understanding health and disease. Art reflected the full depth of what was experienced. Gloomy motifs coexisted with images of hope and rebirth. Sculptors, artists, and poets created works that did not merely record the horrors of the plague, but told of the resilience of the human spirit. The plague became a bitter lesson for Europe, a lesson that led to changes in views on life, death, and the role of humans in the world, paving the way toward a future full of challenges and hopes. The loss of millions of lives created a void that could not be filled simply by returning to the previous way of life. New hierarchies and power structures began to form in societies as many members of the nobility and clergy disappeared irrevocably. Power shifted to those who survived and adapted to the new conditions. And with this, the social order changed, becoming more mobile, dynamic, and sometimes unpredictable. Trade routes that once connected cities and countries before the epidemic were disrupted. But it was precisely through these upheavals that the active development of new routes and forms of trade began. European merchants, scholars, and craftsmen began seeking new knowledge and resources, traveling beyond the old world. This process became an important impetus for the beginning of the Age of Discovery, which forever changed the face of the planet. Alongside economic and political changes in society, the demand for knowledge that could explain what had happened grew. The revival of science and philosophy, the awakening of interest in the human mind and the nature of things, all of this became a response to the catastrophe that revealed not only the vulnerability of humans, but also their inherent strength. People began to value time, moments of joy and connection more, because death was no longer a distant, abstract concept. It was here, near, always, one step ahead. This awareness made people seek meaning in every day, every act, every glance. The plague, despite all its horror, became a catalyst for change, destroying the old and opening the way to a new, unexplored, and hopeful world. Amid the ruins and deserted streets where life once thrived, new centers of cultural and social revival emerged. City squares, once filled only with pain and fear, became places of gathering and exchange of ideas. People who had survived hardships began forming societies and guilds, combining efforts to restore and develop crafts, trade, and art. Education played a key role in this transformation. Monasteries and churches, which had previously concentrated educational functions, gradually gave way to secular schools and universities, where not only theology, but also sciences, mathematics, and philosophy began to be taught. This shift marked the beginning of the Renaissance, an era when human intellect and creativity became the main drivers of progress. The revival of art carried both the memory of tragedy and the aspiration for light and beauty. Paintings and sculptures depicted scenes of suffering, but also conveyed hope, faith in renewal and harmony. Music, becoming more complex and expressive, became a way of communicating with the divine and a means of healing souls. At the same time, changes occurred in public consciousness. People began to reflect more deeply on the meaning of life, their role in the world, and the fragility of human existence. Philosophical reflections on mortality, fate, and free will received new impetus, paving the way for the development of humanism. These changes, triggered by the horrific catastrophe, influenced not only the generations that survived the plague, but also the entire course of history, forming the foundation of the modern European world. The plague, as a dark omen, left an indelible mark on the souls of people, becoming a symbol of life's unpredictability and fragility. Generations raised in the shadow of the epidemic learned to value every moment and the importance of human connections. In this new world, where death walked close, people began seeking meaning and comfort in various forms: religious, philosophical, artistic. Religion experienced a complex period of transformation. The church, long an unshakable authority, faced doubts and criticism due to its inability to prevent mass death. Many believers sought new ways of understanding the divine, stimulating the emergence of diverse religious movements and reforms. Philosophy and theology sought a balance between despair and hope, asking questions about the nature of evil, fate, and free will. New schools of thought arose, which would later form the foundation for humanism and the secularization of society. In art, this crisis manifested in the appearance of dark, somber motifs, the dance of death, scenes of suffering, depictions of final hours of life. However, alongside this, a bright side emerged. Images of rebirth, victory of the spirit over death, beauty and harmony of nature, as a reminder of life's cyclical nature and hope for the future. These changes shaped a new perception of humans in the world, where death ceased to be just an end, but became part of a complex and multifaceted life process, inspiring the search for new meanings and values. The social changes caused by the plague penetrated all spheres of life: economy, politics, culture, and everyday relationships. Massive mortality altered the demographic picture, causing a labor shortage that led to wage increases and improved conditions for commoners. The feudal system began to collapse under the weight of new realities, giving rise to more flexible forms of labor and property organization. The urban population, having experienced loss, sought new forms of social solidarity and mutual aid. Brotherhoods and guilds not only regulated economic activity, but also served social support functions, helping families of the deceased and the sick. These institutions became bastions of stability in unstable times. In politics, shifts were observed. Centralized states strengthened, attempting to take control of healthcare and public order. The first legislative acts aimed at combating epidemics appeared. Sanitary norms and quarantine rules were established. This was an early stage in the formation of state institutions responsible for population health. Culturally, the plague provoked a re-evaluation of human nature and the role of humans in the universe. Literature and philosophy increasingly embraced themes of mortality and the futility of existence, reflected in works filled with tragedy and philosophical reflection. At the same time, comforting ideas emerged about overcoming the fear of death through knowledge, faith, and creativity. Thus, the plague became a powerful catalyst for change, fundamentally transforming European society and leaving a deep imprint in its historical memory. Panic and fear of the unknown disease gripped European cities and villages, forcing people to shut themselves indoors, avoid contact, and flee infected areas. Despite this, the plague spread with relentless force. Rodents and fleas, invisible carriers of death, penetrated every crack and corner. People did not understand the causes of what was happening. Their medical knowledge was limited, and every new case of illness was perceived as a death sentence. In these conditions, fear and despair bred superstitions and mystical beliefs. People sought scapegoats, blaming outsiders, Jews, the poor, and entire communities for bringing the plague upon them. This wave of hatred erupted into pogroms and violence, adding human tragedies to already existing sufferings. Meanwhile, despite the horror and chaos, there were people who tried to fight the disease. The first doctors, healers, monks sacrificing themselves to help others. They observed, recorded symptoms, tried to isolate the sick, although they did not know how to stop the spread of the disease. Their knowledge and courage became the foundation for future medical discoveries. These pages of history will forever stand as a testament to how the human spirit fights death, not giving up even in the most hopeless circumstances. The plague, destroying the old world, gave rise to a new one, where knowledge, faith, and compassion became the main weapons against an invisible enemy. The city streets, deserted and silent, gradually became the stage for countless stories. Stories of pain and loss, courage and human solidarity. Every house, every family experienced the bitterness of loss, watching as the plague took loved ones without warning or mercy. The faces of neighbors changed, and with them, the very essence of life changed. People became more cautious, yet deeply longing for normalcy. Nevertheless, even in the darkness of despair, lights of hope flickered. Healers and physicians, armed with modest knowledge, tried to alleviate suffering, developing the first methods of quarantine and sanitary measures, albeit primitive. The community, facing a common calamity, learned to support each other. Some cared for the sick, others gathered food and water, others prayed for those who could no longer be saved. These moments reminded of the strength of the human spirit and solidarity. Despite divisions by class, wealth, and origin, the calamity united everyone. In this new society, forged in the fire of trials, new values emerged: mutual aid, compassion, and the will to live. However, fear and uncertainty continued to haunt people. Every rustle, every sudden ailment was perceived as a harbinger of death. But it was precisely in these conditions that stories, legends, and myths were born. Attempts to comprehend the incomprehensible, to give fear form and meaning in order to fight it. The plague became not only a physical enemy, but a test for human consciousness, forever altering the perception of life and death. The plague did not merely destroy bodies. It tore apart the fabric of society, changed established norms, and challenged familiar notions of justice and order. Laws that once seemed eternal lost their power in the face of mass death. Authorities, often powerless against the epidemic, lost the trust of the people, and with it, old social contracts crumbled. New forms of power and governance emerged. Local councils, civic assemblies, where the voices of ordinary people began to sound louder. In some regions, peasants and artisans gained the opportunity to influence decisions previously reserved for the nobility. This contributed to the gradual erosion of the feudal hierarchy and the formation of the foundations of future democratic systems. At the same time, fear and uncertainty strengthened tendencies toward conformity and scapegoating. Often the weakest and most vulnerable bore the brunt of accusations and persecution. This duality, progress and regression, hope and fear, became a defining feature of the era. Culture, reflecting these contradictions, developed in two directions. On one hand, a rising faith in science, knowledge, and enlightenment. On the other, an intensification of mystical and religious movements, offering comfort and answers to questions science could not yet explain. Thus, the plague epidemic became not only a tragedy, but a turning point in European history, when the old world collapsed and a new world was born out of chaos and fear. In the shadows of ruined cities and empty village homes, reflections on human fate and the meaning of life flourished. The great minds of the era, from philosophers to writers, sought to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe by turning to questions of mortality, suffering, and hope. It was a period of profound spiritual crisis, where familiar beliefs were questioned and people searched for new landmarks in a world where death had become a constant companion. Works of art emerged that reflected the tragedy and horror of the plague. Paintings, sculptures, and literary works filled with symbolism and allegory. Images of the dance of death, martyrs, and the dying penetrated people's hearts, prompting contemplation of the inevitability of fate and humanity's place in the infinite universe. At the same time, brighter themes arose: hope for salvation, the rebirth of nature, the triumph of life over death. These ideas highlighted the duality of human existence and served as consolation in dark times. Public consciousness changed. The first attempts at systematic study of the disease appeared, and medical science began to emerge as an independent discipline. People began to understand that death was not merely divine punishment, but a phenomenon subject to analysis and struggle. This pivotal moment in history laid the foundations for the development of European civilization, which, having passed through the fire of the plague, gained new strength to move forward. The outbreak of the plague changed not only the social and cultural landscape, but also the economic structures of Europe. Massive mortality among peasants and artisans caused a sharp decline in production, leading to shortages of goods and rising prices. Trade, one of the main driving forces of the economy, suffered serious shocks. Ports and trade routes emptied. Merchants became wary of traveling between cities, fearing infection and spreading the disease. However, over time, new economic processes began, triggered by the demographic changes. The labor shortage forced landowners to offer better working conditions, which ultimately raised the living standards of the remaining workers. Many peasants gained the opportunity to lease land on more favorable terms or even become free. These changes laid the groundwork for the gradual dissolution of the feudal system and the strengthening of capitalist relations. In cities, new classes began to form: wealthy merchants and entrepreneurs who used the circumstances to expand their influence and capital. The economic dynamics became increasingly complex and multifaceted, reflecting both crisis and potential for development. The plague became a catalyst for profound economic and social transformations, overturning traditional foundations and creating new opportunities for European society. With the spread of the plague, a deep anxiety for future generations arose in Europe. Families lost breadwinners, children were left orphaned, and society faced a demographic collapse whose consequences were felt for decades. The reduction in population affected all spheres of life, from agriculture and production to spiritual and cultural life. Yet, it was in this dark period that people began to recognize the value of human life and the importance of community. New customs and traditions emerged, aimed at preserving the memory of the deceased and supporting those who survived. Memorial services, processions, and gatherings became places for those seeking comfort and strength. The first seeds of social institutions appeared, which later evolved into forms of charity and social protection. Churches and monasteries not only provided spiritual support, but also actively aided the sick and the poor, becoming centers of humanitarian help. Amid fear and pain, these expressions of solidarity and care helped people cope with the horrors of the epidemic, laying the foundation for a more just and compassionate society in the future. The plague pandemic sharply altered the relationship between the living and the dead in European consciousness. Humility in the face of death became a dominant theme, reflected in religious rituals and everyday practices. New traditions related to burial and commemoration emerged, emphasizing the unpredictability and all-encompassing nature of death. Numerous cemeteries and graves grew around cities, filling with countless victims of the disease. Local communities organized mass burials, sometimes without usual ceremonies, due to the overwhelming number of the deceased. People strove to maintain respect and memory despite the catastrophe, building memorials appealing to the divine for comfort. The plague also gave rise to a special perception of time. Life and death were now seen as cycles, filled with inevitability and simultaneously hope for rebirth. This philosophical reflection permeated literature, art, and religious teachings, shaping a new paradigm of understanding human existence. The rethinking of death and memory became an important stage in Europe's spiritual development, helping society cope with the scale of the tragedy and find new strength for life. The plague epidemic deeply impacted Europe's religious institutions. On one hand, faith became a support for millions, giving strength to endure suffering and loss. People turned to prayers, services, and pilgrimages, hoping for divine intervention and salvation from the dreadful disease. The Church played a central role in organizing care for the sick and accompanying the dying on their final journey. However, at the same time, growing despair gave rise to doubts and criticism of traditional religious teachings. Some saw the plague as punishment for the sins of society, others as a test of faith and spiritual choice. This period became one of profound spiritual searching, with various movements rising inside and outside the Church, aimed at reform and renewal. Monasteries and temples, despite heavy trials, remained centers of knowledge, medicine, and culture. It was there that manuscripts, medical recipes, and scientific works were preserved, later serving as the foundation for the development of European science and medicine. Thus, the plague became not only a cause of destruction, but also a catalyst for changes in spiritual life, opening the way to new ideas and understandings that shaped Europe's future. During the plague period, medicine was in its infancy, and the epidemic became a harsh test for doctors and healers. Despite limited knowledge about the nature of the disease, medical specialists tried to find effective ways of treatment and prevention using available means: herbs, bloodletting, rituals, and various ointments. Many methods proved ineffective, and some even worsened patients' conditions. But the attempts to combat the disease laid the groundwork for further medical development. Doctors and healers worked under constant fear, confronting hopelessness and the rapid spread of infection. Often they themselves became victims of the plague, which intensified the sense of tragedy and helplessness. Nevertheless, their efforts were not in vain. It was during these years that the first medical institutions were formed, and the first rules for quarantine and isolation of the sick appeared. The epidemic demonstrated the importance of a scientific approach and systematic study of diseases, which became the foundation for future medical discoveries. The experience of fighting the plague greatly influenced the formation of European medicine and healthcare, turning tragedy into a lesson for generations. The plague epidemic radically changed the foundations of family life and social bonds. The sudden and massive loss of loved ones shattered traditional family structures, forcing those who remained to survive. Parents died, leaving children orphaned and wives and husbands, widows and widowers. As a result, many children and the elderly became vulnerable and dependent on the mercy of neighbors and the community. Families were often forced to adapt to new realities, joining with other survivors for mutual survival. New forms of support, mutual aid, and cooperation emerged, which later served as the foundation for the development of social institutions. Society faced the necessity of rethinking values. Family strength, respect for life, and mutual trust became the cornerstones of the new reality. Despite horror and suffering, people found the strength to continue living, preserving the memory of the dead and passing hope to future generations. These changes made a profound contribution to shaping European society, altering its social fabric and establishing new guidelines for relationships between people. In the depths of European towns and villages struck by the plague, there was not only physical, but also spiritual emptiness. People, having lost their loved ones and the familiar ways of life, experienced feelings of loneliness and meaninglessness. This inner crisis was expressed through religious and philosophical searches, attempts to understand and make sense of suffering and death. At the same time, it was in these dark times that new forms of art and culture emerged, reflecting both anguish and hope. Poets wrote verses full of pain, yet faith in rebirth. Artists created dark but poignant images that conveyed an atmosphere of fear and anticipation of change. Music and theater became means of expressing collective emotions and ways to unite people in times of despair. These cultural expressions not only helped endure the tragedy, but also contributed to the formation of a new identity among European peoples, strengthening a sense of community and hope. Thus, the plague became not only a challenge to life, but also a catalyst for profound changes in Europe's spiritual and cultural spheres. After the deadly plague swept through the towns and villages of Europe, leaving behind devastation and desolation, life slowly began to return to its former rhythms, but in a completely new form. Those who survived the horror and loss carried away not only fear, but valuable lessons from the tragedy. Society changed. New perspectives on the value of life, individual responsibility to the community, and the inevitability of change emerged. In rural areas, surviving farmers rethought their relationship to the land and labor. Liberation from harsh feudal bonds gave impetus to the development of freer and more independent forms of farming. In cities, craftsmen and merchants who had endured the crisis began building new social structures and economic networks that were more flexible and adaptable to change. The plague revealed the fragility of human existence, but also the strength of the human spirit. Society became more conscious, learning to value health, solidarity, and education. This later became the foundation for the Renaissance era, when knowledge, art, and science shone brightly again, dispelling darkness and fear. Thus, through suffering and loss, Europe was reborn, transformed and prepared for new challenges of the future. The consequences of the plague that swept across Europe were multifaceted and profound, touching every aspect of society's life. The pandemic left an indelible mark in history, altering the course of civilization. A time of fear and ignorance passed, giving way to new knowledge, philosophical reflections, and practical transformations. After many years of battling the disease, people began to recognize the value of human life not only as an individual gift, but also as an integral part of the social organism. There was a growing understanding that the health and well-being of each person directly affect the fate of the entire community. The first steps toward creating systems of healthcare, sanitation, and disease prevention emerged, later becoming the foundation of modern medicine. The plague not only changed social and economic structures, but also stimulated a reassessment of cultural and religious views. It revealed the fragility of human nature, while simultaneously demonstrating the strength of the spirit and the capacity for rebirth. Artists, writers, and thinkers embodied in their works the complexity of human emotions, from fear and despair to hope and faith. This historical cataclysm became a symbol of trial, through which Europe was able to find a new identity. Society, having endured incredible suffering, emerged from the shadow of death with renewed strength, ready for progress, discoveries, and transformations that shaped the modern world. Thus, when death came in black, it brought not only destruction, but also the beginning of a new era, an era of understanding, compassion, and human renaissance.